and I am here with Bram Gieben, the author of The Darkest Timeline, Living in a World with No Future from Revol Press. We're going to be talking about it today. You're also the host of Strange Exiles, correct? The
That's
podcast?
correct.
And full disclosure, I am also an author at Revol Press. In fact, I'm writing a book that's similarly bleak, which is called Walktopia to Barbarism, and the last chapter will probably be entitled "It's Been All Barbarism the Whole Time." But so we're from an uplifting press these days, apparently. But I've been reading your book, and I've listened to your you talk with Mike Watson over on I don't think it's called the Acid Left podcast, but that's the stream I got it on.
You Rise and Be Damned now.
Yeah, which is kind of a better name anyway. And I'm going to go ahead and preface this with that this book is bleak in a way that a show that's had Danny Besner and Benjamin Studebaker and myself on it, I don't think we actually go as far as you. So I think we should talk a little bit about what the premises of the Darkest Timeline, like why do you feel like people have tried to make so much of the political ramifications of these apocalyptic narratives, and what do you think it actually says?
So to talk a little bit about the premise of the book, it's an analysis of the apocalypse, in both the aesthetic sense, in the scientific sense, in the mythological sense. I try and look at it from several of these aspects. And I think what I'm trying to discuss is the ways in which the fact that we've conceptualized these apocalyptic futures can get in the way of recognizing the dystopian aspects of the present. So that's summed up, at the start of the book by a quote attributed to William Gibson, which is that the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. I think a little bit later on in the book, I quote somebody from the Otolith group, it's Angelica Sakar, and she says that the apocalypse can start at different times depending on where you are. It's very subjective, So for someone dispossessed of their ancient homelands, that's when the apocalypse begins. For other people, it's going to be different. So I think that's where the premise begins, is the idea that we already live in a very dystopian present. And also that the ways in which we write about the potential disastrous consequences of technological acceleration, of climate collapse, we quite often write in the tone of, if we can do this, or if we can't do that. It's very much premised on the idea that action is still possible. When in actual fact, if you look at the a lot of the evidence and take a broader view, look at the worst case scenarios that people are increasingly talking about happening, particularly with regards to climate. We're already too late for a lot of these solutions, or those solutions could have unintended consequences. So these are all things I unpack in the book. But to qualify it a little in terms of this, whether this is a doomer manifesto, I don't think of it as such. It's more of a book about time and about the idea of the future. And I think, in terms of interpreting the future, we have these various ideologies and ways of looking at things that are teleological, that have an end goal in mind. I've looked at, writers like John Gray, who have very strong views on progress, and, that our belief in that might be something of a legacy of that Christian, kind of Judeo-Christian, kind of millenarian tendency. I've also looked at the analysis of people like Zizek. I think one of the reasons Zizek is such an important thinker is that he, came to be as a thinker, as a philosopher, in a collapsing culture, in a collapsing regime, seeing the fall of communism in his home country. So I think that gives his insight, a particular keenness and sharpness that you can use to think about the various ways we talk about the future, both in the utopian and the dystopian.
Yeah, I'm actually thinking thinking about this a little bit, and there's kind of a time theme actually even in the book that I'll that you may not have noticed, but I'll point out to you. And I was looking at your references. But that you start with living in with a quote even before the William Gibson quote from Living in the End Times by Slavoj Žižek. And I have always thought that that was one of the more underrated Žižek books.
It's one of my favorites, actually. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think one of the first I read. I'll read the quote here because it's a really good one.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this has a bearing on talking about things like proposed solutions to climate change, like cloud seeding, or all these kind of like moonshot methods of perhaps capturing some carbon and fixing things. So Zizek writes, domination over nature necessarily entails the class domination of people over other people. The way to rid ourselves of our masters is not for humankind to become a collective master over nature, but to recognize the imposture in the very notion of the master.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this. The two ways that climate is spoken about right now in a lot of left-wing circles and a lot of critical circles. And in one case, you get like the idea that, oh, if we don't do something about it drastically, we're all going to die. To which I say, a lot of us are going to die, but you're probably not that lucky that you're all going to die. We humans have survived actually pretty big shifts in climate before, although, and we know this from genetic population bottlenecks. So it's not even like the first time this has happened. It's the first time it's our fault. That's just a little bit different, but I find that that the total, we might call the total apocalypse, the no one gets through the collapse. While I do think we always have to entertain that as a possibility, sometimes I find that is equally just as much of a dominating cop out as the, oh, we can just seed the clouds or use carbon capture, etc. Because it's just not to say that we shouldn't do some of that. Although, like you, I have very much concerns that everything we'll do to mitigate climate change will have drastically unforeseen consequences, because I know the history of ecological intervention from people in the past that come from the southeastern United States, whose entire landscape was altered in the late 19th, early 20th century because the plantation farming system completely stripped all the forest of the region, and they tried to put the forest back quick growth. And what they did was a mixture of bringing in pine trees and Japanese foliage, and it went horribly wrong. It led to kudzu and giant pine and all this stuff. And most people who grow up in the Southeast barely know that that landscape is like largely modern and largely not indigenous. So, I always think about those case studies when we're like, oh, we're going to get really, optimistic about some climate intervention. And I'm like, well, those things almost always do something you don't see. Like,
they have a reaction. I mean, in a historical sense, large-scale interventions in natural processes. I mean, arguably everything we do is that. Like, that's the story of humanity. It's the story of agriculture. So there is a way to balance these things, to balance human activities with natural cycles. In actual fact, previous societies have done a much better job of that than us. It's the industrial societies that have come to these disastrous consequences. And the interventions of large-scale industrial societies into natural cycles does have a terrible history. I mean, we don't need to mention the 5-year plan, in Russia. We don't need to mention, the disastrous effects of Maoist communism. The campaigns to kill pests that resulted in the deaths of, countless numbers of people. I interviewed a guy called Josh Ellis from a podcast, and he's been writing about climate collapse in an American context for quite a while. And he actually talks about the the way that basically the way that the boundaries were drawn between states and how that relates to those states are supplied with water from the nearest large body of water, like how reservoirs are distributed. And because of the choices that were made, back when that was being decided, essentially a lot of counties are going to run dry. And that's currently, brought American agriculture to a tipping point, to a point where it would be very easy to lose a cycle of crops. And then you have cities like Las Vegas, where Josh is from, where it's now illegal to build new housing without air conditioning, because it's technically impossible to live there as a human being under those temperatures without serious scientific intervention. So I think the choices we make now, even the choices that are the right choices to mitigate the worst effects of climate change, even those could have unintended consequences. So I write a bit
Absolutely.
about that. Yeah. I
Well,
think where
I
John
mean,
Gray, sorry to
go ahead.
rabbit on, but like where John Gray comes into this was with kind of his skepticism about the idea of progress. And when he's writing about transhumanism, what he says is that the idea of escaping the human cage and uploading yourself into some sort of digital hereafter, that's too is a project that kind of depends on infrastructure, like human infrastructure that's got to be maintained. So if you go through some sort of societal collapse, that infrastructure too is threatened. I think the same is true of what we're talking about here in terms of agriculture. Is those systems are just very, very fragile. They depend on a stability in human relations and in human climate conditions that we've had for a very long time. There's nothing to particularly suggest that those are safe. In fact, we've got quite a lot of evidence to kind of suggest the opposite.
Actually, I live in the Mountain West, so I'm about 7 hours north of Josh if he's in Las Vegas, or maybe not even quite 7
He's
hours.
now in Britain. Actually, he's moved away, but
Yes, he's moved
Vegas
from
was where he wrote a lot of his kind of journalism about the climate and things like that.
he's moved from one hellscape to a completely different kind of hellscape. So about to say, normally I would say getting out of Vegas is a good idea, but to Britain, I don't know. Although ecologically, probably a sounder idea. Vegas should not exist.
That's true. It's quite green and leafy here.
Yeah. If you've ever been to Vegas, once you leave the Strip, you're in a flat desert that's just filled with strip malls, and you realize that there's no way that the water needed to maintain the kind of insane extravagance of the Strip is like maintainable for that long. Here in Salt Lake City, we are building housing as fast as you can get it up, but we don't really have the water for the housing. So to put it another way, we've been talking kind of not totally as a joke about the future in which we have a giant non-fatal but very unpleasant arsenic cloud rising from the lake bed of the Salt Lake because we've run out of the water. And the local politicians, before we had 2 years of good snow, which have been kind of flukes, were arguing that we needed to cut down the trees to save the water.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, this is like almost, this isn't even farce or LARP. It's so beyond that. It's like so obviously stupid you can't even fathom it. And I think that's interesting to deal with the United States. You are absolutely right that water right problems are a big issue with the states because of the way water access is drawn from upstream and downstream. And often you have over siphoning of reservoirs for major cities, but you also have weird, like uh, a lot of ecological laws in the United States create weird downstream effects. So, like, for example, there's an endangered species of mussel in Florida that we have to siphon off a whole lot of water to, at the cost of entire ecosystems upstream in Alabama and Georgia. And it's like, so like, okay, we're saving one really endangered mollusk. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but we're doing it at the expense of other, not just, the urban infrastructure, whatever, which, maybe we should talk about that. Because a lot of it's highly inefficient here, because our water infrastructure is like over 100 years old in the East Coast cities in a lot of cases, and it's not easy to redo because the infrastructure has just been built on top of. And I think John Gray got me thinking about this a long time ago, actually. I like to call John Gray my favorite reactionary. Because he is, for those you don't know, he is a reactionary. Like,
I think for me, like, his core text, like, is Straw Dogs, and it's I tried to, I guess, like, pay homage to the style in which that is written, in that it's very it just proclaims itself. It doesn't qualify. It doesn't really bother giving the other side of the argument. It just makes declarative statements, and I think, like, so, in terms of the darkest timeline, where does that come from? It's from the show Community. And in the show Community, their alternate history, their darkest timeline, which is a little bit like the Star Trek mirror universe, it begins with the roll of a dice by one of the characters. I think that's kind of a good metaphor for where we are now, in that some aspects of living in a collapsing world, a world where the things we've become accustomed to under capitalism become less available to large amounts of people. All of these things could be upstream consequences of choices that we make now. And I think, the example that you gave there with the kind of the local ecological distribution of water to one project undermines the precarious nature of an ecosystem elsewhere. Those are the kinds of choices that we're making, and they're quite existential. And I think, like, even when you see people write about the latest warnings from climate scientists, they're always phrased in the tones of if we take radical action now, or unless we take radical action now. I think I was trying to write something that came from the point of view of assuming that no radical action would be taken, or that any radical action that is taken might have also disastrous consequences. And back to that point of the unequal distribution of the apocalypse, even back to the what we've been talking about in terms of water supplies. In South Africa recently, there were whole townships going without water. I think you've had similar things happening on the Mexican border, perhaps in Arizona, maybe Texas, I can't remember. So this is I think what I'm saying is that, like, most of American society might not right now be exposed to the problems that come with water scarcity. But the idea that that's not coming for everyone in the mid to long term, or even the mid to short term, that depends on having a lot of faith in things like supply chain infrastructure, the corroded infrastructure of things like electricity networks, water networks. For a long time, capitalism hasn't invested in these infrastructure projects, and as such, we live in a bit of a crumbling world that's ill-equipped to respond to the challenges that we face. So yeah, I think, like, that's the question: living in a world with no future. If it is the case that there might be very little we can do to avert the worst effects of accelerating technology, or accelerating collapse, there must be a way to find what John Gray calls the good life within that. So I was trying to find that point of the good life, and also just think a little bit about what it means to predict the future, what it means to presume a particular arc of history from where you're standing. So these are the kinds of things I get to in the later chapters.
Yeah, I think the chapter that seems really relevant to me when we're talking about this is a transhuman nostalgia chapter. I think actually that's where you mentioned the John Gray good life quote. And I want to go into that because I was very much feeling, your book actually spoke to mine in a way that I wasn't expecting it to. I've been writing a book on the quote Millennial Left, a term that I've used reluctantly. People, I picked it up from Platypus Affiliated Society, and I use it because I unfortunately think that there is a generational demarcator, even though it's not clean. Like, the Millennial Left really starts with Gen Xers like Mark Fisher, and it ends with whatever the hell's happening now, which aren't really millennials either. But there is a clear denotation for me that your book actually hints at and reference more than an argument. So I was looking at the timestamp for a lot of when we were looking at these key arguments, and right after the Bush administration is when we get this first round of what do we do with if we're actually dealing with the apocalyptic, and that's John Gray Straw Dogs is from that time period a little bit before, but uh, he's always been kind of a dour conservative, and but around the Bush administration, he pretty much just gives up on humanity.
Yeah.
But and and when we talk about him as a dour conservative, he's also kind of a socialist a little bit, but in a very like reluctant and almost bitter way. If you read New Dawn by him, where he just argues about he attacks neoliberal capitalism as like one of the worst purveyors of false optimism. But I was thinking about this because I was thinking about the way in which this millennial left has been bookended by this apocalypse question and by people like capitalist realism had a lot more relevance after Fisher died in a lot of ways than when he wrote it, even though its cultural milieu is very much the aughts. Like it's very much from 2004 to 2008, and it's references. And in fact, I was actually laughing at a little bit of what Fisher argues in a capitalist realism, because he in his critique of like a lot of pop culture, because later on Fisher around the times of Politics and Joy starts embracing that pop culture, particularly like the Hunger Games and whatnot, and I found that weird because I was like your own analysis in your earlier work indicates that you realize this is kind of a trap. So, I mean, I guess we're kind of jumping around here. So let's go into the transhuman stuff, and then we'll come back to Fisher. So,
Cool.
what do you think? I will say this: the transhuman, we've seen some of that with like the AI fears and people sounding like there's a lot of people now who are tech billionaires who also sound like Nick Bostrom, but you kind of realize there's a weird self-aggrandizement in that, where they're like, oh yeah, our stuff can destroy the world, so you should totally like listen to us because we'll put a stop to it. And you're like, your stuff can barely answer the question on that I asked it on ChatGPT in a way that actually answers the question. So I'm not sure that you're accurate about our singularity overlord from the LLM, but like it does seem like around 2009 is when we saw this real cultural explosion around transhumanism, and it's kind of come back, but it's come back now without any of the optimism of its first round. Like I mean, you remember Ray Kurzweil and whatnot, like all those people are in the end of the aughts who were like, we're going to be immortal soon, and like.
So Kurzweil's still going. I don't know if you saw him recently on Rogan.
Oh boy.
It was really funny. I've not heard a podcast with so much dead air in a long fucking time, and it's because Kurzweil is still, telling us with what he considers very accurate statistical backup that the singularity is coming and that it's going to be benign. But Rogan has seen a lot of apocalyptic movies, so he keeps pushing back with really dumb questions like, "Yeah, but what if robots, man? Like, what if Skynet?" And basically, Kurzweil does eventually say, well, yeah, it could be catastrophic if there was a super intelligent AI and it made decisions about the human race much along the problem, like the paperclip problem, where it decides that because it's in charge of producing paperclips, it's going to convert the human race to paperclips or whatever. But in terms of like my arguments about transhumanism here, I mean, I'm very much, following what John Gray's written there about it, which is that it's kind of an artifact of the physical world. All of the promises of the digital realm are very much artifacts of the physical realm. It's very much the same in terms of the all of the identities that we might try to inhabit. if you think about the idea of virtual reality, it's a completely singular first-person view of the world. If you look at first-person shooters like Call of Duty, everybody who is not the player is basically collateral. So we're coming towards a conception of identity that's dictated by transhumanism that kind of replicates the very subjective, singular point of capitalism. So I think at the same time as I don't believe that progress is as kind of the thing that should like that's basically the foundation of neoliberal hegemony is scientific progress, technological progress. And I definitely don't go to a dark place like Nick Land of saying that the acceleration of this is going to take us to some kind of singularity. I think it's a double bargain. The scientific interventions that we could make to restore balance to the ecosystem, they are potentially disastrous, but so are the consequences of retreating from it into anything that transhumanism can promise. Even the identities we inhabit in our own physical bodies, the ways we define ourselves, all of these are potentially at the moment kind of under threat, from automation, from AI, from social media and the way that we've come to inhabit, very online avatars that serve as proxies for us. So I think we've already started to retreat into that a transhumanist realm, but I definitely think of it as a retreat rather than being an advance of a form of progress. Yeah, I don't know. I maybe wouldn't stop there though. Like in a later essay in the book, I'm writing about the metaverse, and Mike Watson has written very eloquently as well about this topic, and he's very optimistic about the political and sociological potential of forms of online collaboration in gaming, and that's another arena where technological giants like Musk and Zuckerberg want to dominate and own the metaverse. They want it to be a platform like social media now, where you're kind of corralled into it. So I think like while there's potential there as well for radical organizing, for radical play, for for co-creation, well, much of the potential there feels to me a little bit like the potential of the early internet felt like it had. Like there was going to be infinite space for people to create and collaborate and play, but it's ended up being a quite tightly controlled corporate arena. So I think we're in danger of losing even the spaces where there might be room for us to organize and play. And I think, like much of the book, I'm just trying to say that these things require an unflinching look, rather than to make the argument that nothing can be done, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think, unflinching looks is sort of the motto for the podcast here. But I do think there's a lot to this idea. I read Mike's work on the metaverse, and I was sort of, I was sort of just throwing my head behind it a little bit and going like, well, I agree that potentiality is there, just like I agree that the liberatory internet that we all poo-poo now was an actual possibility. It was choices in the way we organize mediation and the way that we support the internet, the way we power it. It's large physical infrastructure, which is also my big pushback on a lot of theorists around this, like Baudrillard, who just like pretends the physical infrastructure does not actually exist and does not operate along physical mean, and so that somehow we've transcended both the capitalist cycle and other physical limitations because of these computers. And and he sees this as this, his version of the darkest timeline is this totally mediated and authentic world. One, I have no idea what an authentic world is. Sorry, Baudrillard. And two, there are choices. But when Mike was writing about the metaverse, I'm like, we already know what Facebook's going to do about the play as soon as it seems like it might complicate its ability to operate in multiple political territories that are contested. And given the kind of polycentric nature of both the state and corporations, you can kind of see it carteling things off more and more to like Facebook today, where 10 years ago I could say pretty much anything I wanted to on Facebook unless it was outright hate speech or like an undeniable direct threat of which a person would adjudicate. Whereas today, that's all handled by algorithm in a way that's super restrictive, and it even leads to, both on TikTok and on Instagram, Zoomers speaking in a weird code designed to get around the censorship variables. And I think that has been lost on people about what that implies about this cartelled off internet, because even the internet that we have, the World Wide Web, we have it because its initial creators foregoed patent and copyrights on it, both when DARPA and ARPA were working on it in the US military, and later on when British and American scientists came up with the World Wide Web separately from that they did not patent it. If they had, it would have been dead on arrival, ironically. Like, it would not
Tim
have.
Berners-Lee kind of it basically was behind the first internet browser, and because
Right.
of the way that was constructed and copyrighted, we have the open web, which has now been colonized by corporations.
Exactly. But the stuff that we see built on top of that infrastructure today comes pre-colonized, in a sense. Like,
Yes.
And so I am much less hopeful, I guess, about that, because we already have the infrastructure is already captured now in a way that was not in like 2000 or the 90s, or and there does seem to be like this grand search for a return for the early internet, and there are certain platforms that you may have it for a little while. Discord acts like IRC, but as soon as you get certain things involved in it, you get more complicated. So, for example, we have the blogging world of the aughts. Well, we've had an attempt to recapitulate that in the Substack space, right? But the incentives are very different. The blogging world was a way to start yourself off as a writer, but it was also a way to like be engaged adjacent to whatever formal writing positions that you had. Whereas Substack is a substitution often for opinion and other journalism. There's a reason why people like Glenn Greenwald, even though he's one of the richest journalists in the world, have headed that way. And that's because there's not money for them to do the old investigative journalism that they do. And one of the things about the Substack world is that even though it generates enough money for an author to live, or even potentially get, a maybe 7-figure salary if you're really, really big, or not salary, it's not really that, rents effectively. It's not enough for you to be able to go and actually do investigative journalism or anything. So increasingly that journalism kind of devolves into punditry, which has its own separate set of agendas. And there's also no real editorial staff to push back on some of these people, to say like, hey, have you actually been able to prove this thing that you are intuiting or whatever? I don't mean to come down on Seymour Hersh, but Seymour Hersh has made many predictions historically that have been wrong, and the editors have pushed back on him on. Now that he's on Substack, and I do read his Substack and I enjoy it, but like, he does not have that, and he's made statements that have been incorrect. I think we have to think about that when we think about how you're going forward in this information ecosystem with the democratization of information, without also doing what a lot of liberals do, which is to idealize the old gatekeeping system if that was good. But instead of trying to instantiate that, what liberals have actually been doing for the most part, it's kind of hitting them in the ass now, actually. But in the United States with these Gaza protests, because the irony is a lot of the stuff being used against them was stuff that was encouraged to dampen down on Trumpism, and at least on social media, in the 2020s, the early 2020, like 2020, 2021. And now that's being thrown at them with like ramping down political posts, etc., on Instagram. And I was surprised that people were surprised this was happening. Like, because I'm like, you've already done this, and you've done it under the cynical friend-enemy distinction without realizing that these corporations they're not actually as progressive as you've been assuming they were going to be.
No. They're strategically progressive, perhaps. Yeah.
Right. And they're strategically, they're also, those same places are also strategically reactionary. They will,
100%.
it's almost like a metabolic process to capture different markets, whoever think market they're going to gain more from at any particular given time.
And I think there are similar dynamics at play in the people creating the content that goes viral, you know, and are consuming it too. I talked a little bit about this with Jason Miles on This Is Revolution, and you know, in terms of the current campus protests, there was one intervention that I think I was listening to it on a podcast. I think it was blocked and reported, and essentially it was somebody who was a counter protester, or rather was trying to circumvent what had been set up as a checkpoint within a university. And the person was a university student, you know, so paid their fees to attend the university, and they happened to be Black. So they were filming themselves on their mobile phone, making the argument, you know, I'm a Black man, I've paid to be here, I have a perfect right to be here, and you're impeding my progress. So you're claiming that you're liberals. What the fuck is this? But at the same time, the protesters themselves are filming themselves be challenged by this guy. And you can hear in the video, which I think was made by the person who's the counter protester, that they were also trying to shape a narrative and frame a narrative. So I think, like, what I'm saying is, if you think about how differently that plays out to, say, the 1960s protests against the Vietnam War, when there was coverage of that, whether it was photographs or film, that was you know, something that was taking place and then being transmitted via the media to an audience. Whereas what's happening here is there's two sets of people, both of whom are imagining an audience that might or might not be there when the content's going out live, performing to that audience a particular narrative, and those narratives are taking place simultaneously. They're both being filmed, two versions of reality at the same time. So it's a very, very different thing. I think that the way that social media has shaped the way we interact with other people is that we've gotten such a sense from being online of speaking to the gallery. You know, look at how many people start their posts with, "Hey guys," you know, or hey folks," or, you know, it's this idea that you're speaking to not just individuals, but a group of people who are invested in you coming across a certain way or representing a certain point of view. Being on the right side of history might be one way of putting it. You know, that's a very popular side to be on. So I think, like, it's that mediated form of performance, which I try and associate with virtual reality and with simulations in the book. I think it's very easy to create within yourself a simulation. I think that's what you're doing when you create an avatar. I think the more invested you become in an avatar, the more like a simulacrum it becomes, to take it back to Baudrillard, and the more difficult it becomes to tell the difference between the original and the simulacra. You know, I talked about this a little bit with Jason too, but I very much fell for Facebook and the kind of confessional posting of selfies and things like that.
Oh yeah, me too.
I also got drawn into the argument culture that developed on Facebook after 2008 or so, and they had the nested replies, and you could, you know, as soon as someone posted something, you'd get contrary takes and people kind of getting invested in it. And I not only got invested in that, but I got burned quite badly by it. And I think I got burned badly because, like everybody else, I wasn't really being me in those discussions. I was role playing a version of me that was more like how I would like to be perceived by other people, a best version of me, you know? And so when you're challenged, it's not you that's being challenged, it's the perfect version of you that your ego is invested in. And I think it took a long time to deprogram myself from that stuff. And I'm not saying I'm completely deprogrammed. I still post on X. I still post on Facebook. I tell myself it's because I have stuff to promote or things to sell, but I also have a day job. You know, I don't have to be doing that. So I think we're all invested in these forms of performance. What I think it's maybe necessary to think about is the way in which being invested in an avatar, taking part in what effectively adds up to a simulation of a discussion, simulation of an encounter, a simulation even of a fight or a confrontation. What are the psychological and political consequences of that? I wanted to try and engage with that a bit. which does kind of take us back to Bostrom, but I'll maybe park it there for a minute.
No, I read an article by Paul Sutherland that I actually am going to release to the channel. I will have come out to the channel by the time I release the show. So my audience, if they watch everything, which they probably don't, but if they do, they will have been exposed to this argument. But I was picking up on Baudrillard and a little bit Umberto Eco. And so is Paul Sutherland on this idea that like there's a reason why all politics seems both cringe and LARPy. To use LARP is really a term of about 10 years ago, but and the cringe is a more modern term. But the reason why is that so much of politics is viewed so strongly through mediation that, and the mediation is self-curated, that becomes where the politics like is both incoherent and almost knowingly impossible, like
Yes.
whether or not we're talking about Jan 6 or people talking about liberated zones on college campuses. And this is not to go after the Gaza protesters, but there's nothing liberated about those zones. That's just like a performative declaration. You could say you could try to argue from an anarchist or left communist point of view that it's prefigurative, but I don't really see how it's even that, because it is clearly for an audience in a curated way.
Do you know the speech that Zizek gave to Occupy? It's on YouTube. It's quite a famous one, and he basically very briefly he makes the point that this is not the revolution. This is not the counterculture. This is the carnival. Don't get lost in this. And I think like that's. I don't think that was heeded at all. I think we're very much.
You had David Graeber literally saying the opposite, which this was that occupation was the goal itself, and I remember at the time being very much on team Zizek that the carnival's not bad. It's not. And if anything, I will say today, when people go back and talk about how Occupy failed and like they make it sound like they knew it the whole time. And I'm like, I was writing at the time and you motherfuckers were mad at me when I said how Occupy was going to fail, that it necessarily had to fail. And that's the point, that how it failed was going to set the terms for the next round of politics. And what came out of it was a more important thing, which I basically say that now every major political event, that the political event itself is easy to get lost in, that it's that energy is impossible to maintain forever. Often, even if the goals are delimited and possible, the larger context and the shift throughout the system aren't clear. I mean, my most unpopular stance lately is like, while I support people doing a boycott, divest, activism, the BDS stuff, I've also pointed out that like most of what they're focusing on is such a small part of the Israeli economy that it will not have anything like Coke pulling out of South Africa had. It's a completely different structure of an economy, and the past analogy in some ways is a way not to look at that. I think there's a lot of that going on. And I also think this leads to this wild oscillation in the same people. And we can get to Bostrom because I think this does connect between hyper optimism and hyper pessimism in the same person, often within a very small window of time. And I think you and I probably could talk about periods where we've been subject to that because of the way politics has come up and you experience it. It's very hard to keep your head above water. I remember during the second Bernie Sanders campaign, and during what looked like it may have been the consolidation under Corbyn, even cynical me, who had been arguing with Mark Fisher even when he was alive that his sympathies for Corbynism were misplaced, that it's hard to resist that lure. Like, even someone who can be as cynical as me, when everyone's out in it, you're like, well, you do have to have a little bit of intellectual humility and go like, maybe they see something I don't.
Yeah.
Or maybe there's something about some potentiality there that I don't see. And I think that's the right impulse to have, actually, even now. But sometimes it can get you lost in these events where you're like, well, what do we do when Bernie Sanders wins and you don't have a Democratic Party that's like built around that orientation? Like, what is that going to look like? Or, I mean, in the case of Bernie Sanders, we never got that far anyway. But in the case of Corbyn, we kind of did. We saw what it looked like, and it was stochastic. So, I think that's, now we don't know what it would have been like if Corbyn had to actually, be a prime minister. But in this weird way, I was thinking about the Bostrom piece about, progress is not good if you're heading in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about that a lot today, about these other times where it seemed like we were making tangential progress on the left, but we were heading in the wrong direction, and we were actually liquidating ourselves without realizing it. And in Britain today, it is very obvious that that was a left liquidation. But at the time, even to my cynical ass, it was not obvious at all.
I mean,
Um,
I definitely share with you that, like, back in 2008, I was super optimistic about the idea of occupying places and creating temporary autonomous zones. I was reading a lot of Chomsky, I was reading a lot of Hakim Bey, and I was
uh-oh.
creating an internet, I was like, I'd created a website that was publishing kind of edgy alternative stuff, so I'd colonized my little bit of internet and set up my own TAS. And I think, like, the subsequent disillusion with all of those ideas has definitely kind of informed this book. I think, in terms of looking at Corbynism, the significant thing that happened with Corbynism was that it was a populist and youth-led movement. Lots of young people joined Labour because they broadly were progressives, and they saw that Corbyn at least was a man of integrity with some progressive values, broadly speaking. And I think broadly speaking is the level at which most people think politically. So anyway, the Corbyn movement ended in a kind of firestorm of allegations of anti-Semitism. And that was what happened on the doorsteps, is that, all these people who joined Labour, who were canvassing and were out and were very positive about Corbyn's chances, were faced with, the consequences of that being the narrative, that, you couldn't vote for an anti-Semitic candidate, particularly not one who wouldn't push the red button if the Russians fired their nukes. So I think, he was the victim of a big right-wing smear campaign. And when the old new Labour Guard came back in, and there was, like you say, a purge of the Labour left, that was a betrayal of a generation of voters. That was basically taking away at least some glimmer of hope at the ballot box from a great number of people who've become politically involved and active. And a similar thing happened in the wake of the 2014 Scottish independence referendum. People had allowed themselves to be idealistic for a year or two. They'd allowed themselves to entertain very utopian ideas of what would happen after independence was given. And then they had to deal with the fallout, the morning after, when it turns out that, we were outnumbered and outgunned, and that wasn't going to happen. And again, you could make arguments for and against why Scottish independence would be a good thing for the left or for young people. What I think is important to note is that a generation of people around that time had a crushing defeat, and they felt that rather than the optimism that they'd felt for the last few years, maybe the activism they'd been involved in the last few years, rather than thinking this is going in the right direction, they realized it hadn't been going in the right direction for a huge, vast swath of the rest of the population. So in terms of why people are activists and the way they're activists now, the causes they pick up, the causes they get behind, it's very, very atomized. That would be my criticism. It's atomized. But can you be surprised that it's atomized at the points where the kind of, broadly speaking, progressive youth vote has tried to mobilize and get involved in mainstream politics? It's been crushed. And that's consistently happened for a very long time in most of the democracies that you could probably name. A similar thing, you could say a similar story was behind what happened to Bernie not getting the nomination. So these, I think, like the state of the millennial left, I think you mentioned the term earlier, and I'm prepared to talk about it. Like, I think the state of the millennial left it's the legacy of a series of crushing defeats. in which people had allowed themselves to have quite utopian thoughts. So imagine that being a defeated utopian. What kind of crazy projects are you going to get yourselves involved in? What kind of unrealistic demands are you going to make? And how far are you going to allow yourself to be diverted when, in actual fact, disastrous consequences for kind of the whole of humanity are not just coming down the line, but are already here?
Yeah, I mean, we look at today in 2022. I was actually, this might also end up being a chapter in my book, when I was tracing these lines of causation back. Like, you look at the Russia-Ukraine situation, and, you know, I'm not here to adjudicate blame. I think that's actually kind of useless. But you look at the way that all set up, and you know, I start seeing the history at the end of the Soviet Union, but you really see it accelerate. Not Euromaidan, that's actually late. You see it accelerate probably around 2002, 2003, 2004, and the divisions that paid off now are led to the Ukrainian civil war, you know, which we don't call it that, but that's what it was. You know, after Euromaidan, that's already 10 years in the timeline, really. Like, if you look at the long array of causation, like, it's not that it was inevitable, but each step makes it harder and harder to move away from. And so, you look at what NATO and Russia were doing by 2022, and the fact that, like, someone like Biden could predict it. Well, you like, yeah, but you look, if you really go back and look at the steps, it's been obvious to certain thinkers, even certain ones that I think have very dubious politics, like the American analyst Peter Zion. It becomes very clear that, like, for some people, they have seen this coming now for a decade, and it's pretty predictable. One of the things about, you mentioned about the betrayal, I don't want to be victim blaming, but I do think we have to be somewhat honest that there's been an active ignoring of the past among parts of the Millennial Left, because the moves made around Bernie have been moves we've seen before, just like the McGovern campaign similarly seeming to reanimate the Democrats that set up literally the whole electoral regime we have today, as far as like how we get candidates and whatnot, is a result of 68 to McGovern and primaries. And if you look at even how the primary system was set up, it's set up to initially empower more and more people democratically get involved, and disempower these old smoking room filled with labor union leaders whenever cutting what really were corrupt deals, if we're quite honest about it, to being able to game that system for the same results through very minor reforms over the course of 40 years.
Incrementalism.
Right. And incrementally reclaiming, basically. I think we've seen this around from Occupy to the Sanders movement, in that, ironically, what that did is very similar to the betrayal you see around Starmer. But unlike Starmer, I don't think the American version recognized how betrayed it was. Yes, people complained about Bernie, but they immediately, under Bernie's guidance, threw their hat in with the Biden administration, and kind of got played. I mean, I think that's why there's so much anger amongst young people, not just around Gaza. It's hard to know what any of these polls actually mean, because I've been looking at their sample sizes, and they're usually less than 2,000, and I'm like, 2,000 students is not a very big, in a country of 350 million. That's a very small sample size, but nonetheless, it does seem like when people attribute the anger with students to Biden over Gaza, it actually looks like, no, they're angry with him for other reasons. Gaza's just another feather in the cap there. But what they're feeling is this general betrayal. And I suppose if you're 19, it's easy for us to forgive that. But if you're a 35-year-old millennial leftist who's actually been studying this stuff, probably since your mid-20s, you should have been a lot more aware of where this was headed.
Yeah, I think it was perhaps like an unavoidable thing. Yeah, for sure. And I think, like, it's about where you go from what happens when you feel like, you know,
Mm-hmm.
your effort to join in with the mainstream conversation, join in with the democratic process, join, you know, parties like the Democratic Socialist Party, get involved in organizing. If you eventually feel like there's no way that that can ever get to a place that isn't just incrementalism, then that's going to be disillusioning. It's going to put you towards, you know, more being more sympathetic to the idea that the personal is political is in itself enough. That, you know, issues around identity are sufficient for as a battleground for activism and for political change. And the thing is that the activism around those things is very difficult to affect change. It can act as a pressure group and slowly influence things over years, but that's not what's being engaged in. And I think like the intensity of things like the Gaza protests at the moment speaks to the disaffection of the people protesting. They have no faith that their involvement in the system would improve it, if that makes sense. So I think that's the danger, and that's the position that these people have been thrown into, and that accounts for some of their anger. And also, it's, you know, activism. I'm not saying that activism isn't effective. I'm definitely not saying it isn't noble, or that the people who participate in it, you know, and do things that are involved in direct action in communities, those will come from a very good place. It's just very easy for activism that's designed to plug the hole in the crumbling infrastructure of apocalypse capitalism not to be co-opted by the state in the form of loans, in the form of forms and permits, you know. And similarly, the type of activism that is involved around the carnival, you know, as Zizek called it, going and showing up and holding signs and waving placards, is that it does feel good to participate in it. That's very, very easily neutralized or ignored. When it becomes politically dangerous, they shut it down with military force, as they did with Occupy. But the fact that these protests are allowed to continue, the fact that you know, huge numbers of people in Britain can march for various numbers of causes, you know, that speaks to the ineffectiveness of that activism rather than the opposite. So I
Yeah.
think, you know, the Gaza protests are interesting because they have sent in the heavy-handed security reaction to these protests as if they were making a difference, as if it was politically important. Where in actual fact, I think they're probably changing very little. And I think from what I've read of the goals of some of those groups, you know, divesting completely from Israeli investment in universities whose science departments depend almost entirely on those grants. It's just not an ask that's particularly realistic.
No, well, it's actually interesting. Depends on the group and what their ask is, because some of
It's
them,
diverse. Yeah, it's very, very
right.
different groups. And
Some of them, the actual cost of the endowments would be quite low. Some of the if they actually go after grants, however, from the military, then their schools collapse. But I've actually noticed that most of the students haven't even put that together. That they're not asking; they're looking at the endowment stuff. And one thing about, you know, the British and American university system, and this is sadly something the British share with us, is that our universities by this point are basically endowments that have schools attached to them. And the schools are the lowest part of their revenue source. Grant writing, graduate school, the medical industrial complex, and being large landlord. I mean, NYU and Columbia are the largest landlords in New York City.
that's true in Edinburgh as well. They're, you know, one of the biggest landlords in the city, and I think it's probably true in Glasgow as well. They certainly own some of the you know, most valuable property in the best areas of the city. Yeah.
Right. So I mean, yeah, continental Europeans are like, what are you guys talking about? Like, you know, yeah, you guys have you know, tax supported universities that are, or even your private universities, which are basically low endowment and pay to go. No, you know, the Anglo brain rot means that we turn everything into an investment mechanism no matter what. So
I think this is where I'd like to take it back to Bostrom. So
yeah, go.
in the chapter that kind of touches on the simulation argument, which is a paper, you know, he wrote in 1999, I believe. So it came out around about the same time as the Matrix movies, and is as enduring a metaphor, really. I think, you know, the whole "do we live in a simulation" stuff is pretty common trope on the internet, and has been since meme culture kind of awakened. And similarly, the Matrix, you know, with its kind of system of being pilled, like we can now apply pills to any number of things. Saw a meme the other day about being forest pilled, being a forest cell, so it's universally applicable because it's such an elegant metaphor. What Bostrom was talking about with the simulation argument was these nested levels of an ancestor simulation. So once you consider the proposition that you might live in an ancestor simulation, just simulation, sophisticated enough to completely replicate reality and your subjective experience of it, there's no guarantee if there's a civilization powerful enough to produce an ancestor simulation of that quality, but you couldn't tell the difference between it and reality, then there's an entire possibility that within that simulation would be another simulation of similar quality. And so the problem that Bostrom comes to in that paper is, how do you know when you're in the basement level, the original culture that simulated that ancestor simulation? And so it's all dependent on this notion of awakening. And that goes back to the notion of the red pill and the blue pill. As it's put in the Matrix, you've got the choice between the false reality, which is kind of very much like the capitalist consumer reality. You can have your steak and drive your fast car and wear your expensive coat, and you're living a life of affluence, but you're controlled. You might not know it, but you're controlled and surveilled. Or you can have the basement level, the real reality on the Nebuchadnezzar, where it's all a bit gnarly and you've got to fight the machines. But the problem with that as a system of metaphor is that there's no objective proof of the reality that Neo wakes up into. It's equally, it does not offer proof of itself not being a simulation. The Matrix never really solves that problem, as a system of ideas. And I think that's when you get to the bottom of the Bostrom reality stack, you could still be awakened. And that's kind of the reality that we're in now, because we live in such a hole of mirrors where we're constantly acting through avatars. We're constantly participating in simulated forms of performance and behavior and discussion and debate. Because of this, it's very, very easy for us to feel like we've been awakened, like some pink laser beam has hit through the center of our forehead, and suddenly we've realized that we're wrong about one subject or another. Our eyes have been opened, but there's no subjective proof that once you've awakened, that you've reached the bottom of that Bostrom reality stack. That doesn't mean that there's no value in awakening. It doesn't mean there's no value in asking a question. So I connect that to the writer Philip K. Dick. He believed that he'd had a whole new system of time revealed to him. The way he phrased it was the empire never ended. The idea was that the Roman Empire had continued in an unbroken line, and our own current present day time was a holographic simulation designed to keep us in check by the Roman masters. And he actually believed as well that there was a computer system of alien intelligence living in space and kind of helping us in the fight against this false Roman control. So that's obviously very silly. It was all mixed up with a lot of his kind of concerns with Christianity over the years. It was a kind of a Christological system, and it obsessed him until his death. But it doesn't mean it doesn't have any use as a metaphor. It's still a metaphor about social control, just like his best novels. And I think that's the same with Bostrom's writing. Like, he's become quite a controversial figure. I think there was an attempt to kind of cancel him over remarks he'd made on a listserv when he was much, much younger. He's associated with the kind of effective altruism movement, which is increasingly discredited. And I think there's a feeling that he is a reactionary thinker. Long-termism. A lot of people have been challenging those ideas. I think you mentioned a couple earlier. The idea that rogue AIs are more important to think about than present-day climate issues. But his best papers, simulation argument and also the vulnerable world hypothesis, they almost act as satires. They're like a challenge to our thinking about our participation in simulations, our participation as avatars rather than as subjects with agency. And I think that's the key to what I think he's kind of like an important thinker, even if I don't necessarily agree with his position on things. His idea of where progress might be headed and what's the right direction is probably very different from mine. But I think he's, in a way, these are like all clockwork metaphors for our reality and our subjective experience of it. So I think they're useful in helping us navigate a reality we exist in now, which is very mediated, and takes place through proxies a lot of the time.
Well, I was actually, one of the things I was going to give you credit for in your book was smart engagement with a bunch of thinkers that I would think would think the general public maybe rightly perceives as reactionary. We talked about John Gray.
Yeah.
I actually like I said, I think John Gray is my favorite reactionary. Another one that you mentioned in the Pandora Dynamics chapter is Peter Turchin, and you talk a little bit about his statistical inevitability arguments, which I think if you actually read the Clio Dynamic books, his books versus his interview persona is actually quite interesting, because his interview persona, he actually seems to support a lot of the bombastic claims made by journalists, and in his titles of his recent books, he does so as well.
Yeah, he's good at the like doing the memeified headline, but the substance of it is a bit more
his most recent End Times book, as well as his Ages of Discord book. But when you actually read what he says, he statistically caveats a lot of what he goes into. But I was thinking about something that he talks about a lot, which is competitions between elite offering mirroring social problems elsewhere. I think sometimes he over focuses on elites, but I was thinking maybe he has some point when we look at today and we look at like where a lot of these protest cycles go in and out. So I have noticed, and I think I might be writing something about this, how you either have elite protests that spread out to non-elite areas, which is what's happened in the Gaza protests. So you start off with these Ivy League universities with very small percentages of these students being involved in these encampments that are crushed for reasons that I've even read reactionaries who are like, they don't know why we're being so like bring the police down on small encampments of elite students, so that makes it more popular, because, you know, if anything, crushing these things tends to actually exacerbate them. But then there's a counter tendency that does almost the opposite, but it looks very similar. So you look at something like BLM, which twice started in very urban, Black, poor areas about very specific events, and ended in the first round in elite universities, in the second round in elite coastal cities with high wealth disparities, admittedly, but that had a completely different dynamic than the cities in which these events started. Having BLM end in Seattle and Portland is very ironic, since those are literally some of the rightest major metropolitan areas in the country. My point about that is there seems to be a way in which this thing that Turchin writes about, elite overproduction, gets replicated.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about something else that he doesn't write about but relates to it, is that our elites literally don't act like they think there's a future. And I mean that in a very like strict sense, in that they don't set up, like, when has a major political party actually set up a proper succession scheme? I mean, you're in Britain, where like the Tories haven't been able to do that ever. Biden does not have any backbench of any. There's no obvious successor to Biden. There's no obvious successor to Trump. They're both ancient men. They've already both are over the average lifespan of the United States. So that's weird. These universities are attacking their own undergraduate program, right? And actually, if you look at like a lot of these elite universities, their undergraduate programs increasingly a small part of what the university is. It's actually probably the smallest part. Columbia is a university that's mostly grad students, which is also bizarre. But you look at that and you go, okay, well, you know, they're attacking these elite students, but clearly, one, they feel there's too many of them, and two, there is no real addressing of a future there. Like crushing your students like this is actually like turning your own, and literally in some cases turning your own children against you. And in some ways it looks like prior periods. I mentioned 1968. I mean, literally the Democratic Party today is talking about moving their convention partly online to avoid another 1968 convention confrontation. So, you know, they're aware of their past, but there is no conception of the future there. The best that the Biden vision could ever offer anyone was a return to a prior normal. It was not a new and better future. It was, you know, we're not, America is already great, or, you know, we're going to return to the pre-pandemic world. We're going to return to the pre-Trump world. None of that happened. I mean, one of the ironies of the Biden administration is they actually mainly codified Trump era policies. But the other thing that's really sort of shocking about it is, and I do think maybe this relates to your book a bit, they don't seem to have any vision of their own future, even aesthetically. So I was telling someone the other day, well, about a month ago, that it's shocking how the taste of the elites are so pedestrian.
Mm.
and and I was like, the reason why that's shocking to me isn't like some, like, you know, snobbery. It's not like, oh, I think that, you know, elite taste should be better because it was in the past. Look at all those great elites. It's more that it indicates to me that, like, they don't have even an aesthetic program to bequeath to the future.
Mm.
Like, if you think about like avant-garde stuff and its relationship to elite culture, yes, there's a lot of Philistines involved, but there is a sort of like, I am passing down the tone of the future. We, the elites, see it. You pretty plebeians do not, in your bad, undistinct taste, right? When the elite cores like this don't have that distinction, you actually get the feeling like they don't have anything to be. They're not thinking about the future in that way.
Mm.
So I wanted to ask you, like, and maybe this is a way to tie this back into Fisher. What do you do when, like, even the people who are in charge of society don't seem to have their vision of the future either? There's not an extension of the present into the future which these people can speak to. And I
Mm.
think, yeah, it's really obvious in the UK. Like, it's kind of obvious in America, but the UK is like, you know, you guys are turning your country into Argentina, like, as we watch, and Argentina's turning into something else even worse. So, like, uh and inflation's crazy. It looks like Keir Starmer is going to win in a landslide, despite being massively unpopular. And it also looks like that Labor is going to do very little with that, and there's going to be very little difference between the
Mm.
five scattershot Tory governments and whatever the fuck's coming up with a Labor government if they win. Which,
Yeah.
like I said, mathematically, it's almost impossible that they don't.
Yeah.
So, what do you make of that?
A couple of things. I mean, first of all, I'd say I'm 43 and I've never seen a left-wing government in my time, and I don't consider the new Labour government or the coalition, you know, Tory Liberal government to be anything approaching progressive forces. You know, they were absolutely emblematic in their support of neoliberalism, and while you could say that Blair's version of that, you know, achieved a lot in terms of leveling society out a little bit, making it a little less unfair, it didn't fundamentally change the goalposts of Thatcherite neoliberalism. It absolutely reinforced them with a lot of its decisions. So, yeah, is Starmer going to give us anything other than, you know, an even more Tory-like, you know, version of that? It's really, really hard to say. I think, you know, I'm probably quite disaffected politically as well. I think I'd probably struggle to tell you, you know, which way I'd lean in terms of supporting someone to vote for. But to return to Turchin a little bit, you know, what he says about elite overproduction, he says it's a bellwether for a society in decline.
Mm-hmm.
He says that you get to a certain point, and if you look back at all the historical examples, the points at which instability comes into being are much less frequently to do with the working class rising up and having a revolution, and much more frequently to do with there just being too many bureaucrats, too many people with, you know, in competition for elite jobs or elite roles in society. And so he said, you know, he uses that as a way of predicting some sort of collapse or end times. But again, it's, you know, it's phrased in such a way that what he's talking about is using his clear dynamic system to avoid or mitigate some of the consequences of that. And what he prescribes is itself, quite broadly speaking, a neoliberal solution, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's where I was going in that chapter of trying to compare these different forms of prediction. One of the others I talked about was effective altruism, and William McCaskill developed this system called quality adjusted life years. And that's a way of calculating the life quality to individuals that you might be able to help philanthropically. Let's say one is blind and the other is paraplegic. Based on the quality of life, you could assess, which one to save. So it's a very cold and mechanistic way at looking at charitable giving and infrastructure activism. And I think, it allowed the effective altruist movement to justify a lot of things. One of the basic calculations of effective altruism would be that it'd be more effective for you to go work on Wall Street and donate a significant portion of your income to the right funds than it would be to go and train as a doctor and work in the developing world saving lives. And that was Amiya Srinivasana's criticism of effective altruism, effectively, was that that's such a cold calculus. It's it's very, very subject to your movement being filled with corporate interests who basically want a calculus to be able to defend selfish choices. And even one of the effective altruist movements themselves ended up buying a mansion to hold EA events in for celebrity guests. So I think, like, in the same way that McCaskill's system is a mathematical logic, that if you apply a kind of religious faith in it, because you don't really understand how qualies work. Similarly with Church's clear dynamics, if you say, okay, well, he made a good prediction in 2010 that after the 2020 election, America would be very unstable, and so therefore he's plausible. It doesn't necessarily mean that their logic is going to play out in that way, and you actually have no way of telling because you're making bets on a future you won't see. This is the problem with all kind of predictive systems. That's why I kind of touch on Harry Seldon from the Asimov novels about Foundation, is that, for as much as Harry Seldon's system was a method of predicting history, psychohistory, and as much as it shared with Turchin a kind of analysis of the broad sweep of the ups and downs of human cultures and human knowledge and human progress, it was not focused on prediction as much as it was focused on preservation. So the point of the Foundation is to act as an ark for human culture, not to preserve human culture itself, but to preserve the stuff of human culture. So I think, for me, that was where I tried to position myself, both politically, socially, and in terms of offering any kind of solution or way out to the very grim worst case scenario logics that I put in the book. Is I think it's very important for us to value the role of archivist. We're in the business of creating things. We're in the business of telling stories. When thousands of years from now, either our descendants or an alien species kind of stumble across what we've produced, we don't know if they're going to find it useful. We don't know if they're going to be able to understand it. All we can do is hope to add to the archive and hope that there are archivists to preserve it. So I think that's where I land with regard to predictive systems, is that systems that preserve are probably more valuable than systems that predict.
Yeah, I go back and think about I'm kind of a historian of Marxism, Arsatz at this point, and didn't set out to do that, not trained for that, but nonetheless is what it ended up kind of being. And you definitely see this response of predictability in Marxism, where Marx makes a couple of predictions in the 1850s, then moves away from that because they don't happen, and he realizes the problems, and you get this sort of moving away from trying to count the eggs before they hatch. But there is this inevitability doctrine in early Second International and Third International Marxism that is carried over, which leads to all sorts of attempts to predict the quote final crisis or this or that, and it actually leads Marxists to be all over the place politically because their predictions keep on being wrong, and they keep on having to adjust them, and make political alliances partially based on this predictive analysis. That
I think that's Gray's criticism of Marxism generally, is that any theory that depends on a teleological analysis of a final event followed by some sort of utopian society that's completely changed, for him that's just another allegory for the Christian tradition. It's just another allegory for there being an afterlife. It's another allegory for there being a savior. So he's skeptical to the point of complete nihilism about any teleological system. For him, it's almost like it's very easy to identify patterns when you only live, a fraction of 100 years, because on either side of you in history are going to be 100-year movements. But over a long enough time scale, he doesn't find the evidence for a system like Turchin's that would say that there are these echoes and repeating phases. For him, it's chaos, and there's no reason to presume that the arc of any one culture, the arc of any economic system, ideological system, is going to end in a certain place. Anything can happen. Right?
Yeah, well, this is the thing with Turchin. I actually find Turchin's predictions to be a little bit more problematic than a lot of other people do, because I actually find Turchin's understanding of the past to be more selective than other people do. When I read his book about, like, he basically thinks that that this generational cycle thing explains all of history mathematically, and there's only one variable that changes. It's before the Industrial Revolution, Malthus is right. After the Industrial Revolution, Malthus is wrong. That's the only thing he changes. But then he, like, reifies national blocks going backwards and forwards in history. So, like, national data sets are read as, like, descriptive, and even about areas of which we can't really talk about these things being nations in any way that we would talk about today. Like, when you're talking about, like, ancient empires, discrete national borders and whatnot, they don't exist the way they do now. So trying to read that world in terms of these data sets is a very weird thing to actually do. But it also leads to, like, crazy stuff in the contemporary moment, or in the just right before the contemporary moment. So, for example, when Turchin goes to explain the 1950s in the United States and Ages of Discord, what does he do? Well, he says, like, well, it was just this time period where the elites, for whatever reason, were nice and let labor to the table, right? And he's only talking about it in terms of the United States. All right. How do you miss that there's a global context for why the bourgeoisie would have been willing to play that game in that time period? Like, if you miss that in your theory of, like, why everything is going the way it is, and you're, like, not looking at World War II as causative, you're not looking at the existence of the Soviet Union as causative, why should I trust you on your analysis of other things? Because that's blatant.
It's
Like,
selective for sure.
right. And he's not looking at UF wealth patterns after World War II, like the whole, famously George Kennan points out, oh, the United States has 48% of the world's still surviving wealth because the rest of it was destroyed in World War II, or hasn't been unvalorized in underdeveloped nations. And, like, when you're talking about, like, the longue durée of American politics and you don't mention that stuff, I don't know why I should take your predictions all that seriously.
I mean, I would say, like, maybe a better bellwether of a declining culture is its tendency to produce narratives in the form of totalizing systems. Like, I've been reading a lot of Hannah Arendt, and it strikes me that her historical analysis doesn't depend on producing a definitive viewpoint on anything. She does attempt to offer definitions, like in On Violence. She's very, very much in the project of trying to tease out the difference between power and violence and concepts like that. But she's not making a definitive statement. And where she is making a definitive statement is because she's drawing on, like, generations of thinkers and saying this is a broad consensus. And she's letting you still come to your own conclusions. I think, even if you read the whole of Turchin's book and didn't pay attention to the more kind of hyperbolic statements he makes sometimes in interviews and on, in articles, nonetheless, what he's selling there is a totalizing system. So he's selling you a tool that you could use to understand why the world is like it is, much like Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. So I would say that that's, like, his very writing, his attempt to produce a system that's going to explain why things feel like they feel is itself a symbol of a culture in decline. It's a culture that's still trying to find the new big story when perhaps there isn't another chapter,
Yeah, that open-endedness and the faith that the future will settle this is not there, right?
Yes.
Like,
yes.
Yeah. Okay, so this brings us back to where we started, and I think this will be a good final stretch of our conversation. Let's talk about Mark Fisher.
Yes.
Uh, Mark Fisher's clearing inspiration to you. I literally started an essay on the ghost of my life where I say that Mark Fisher is a weird ghost in my own life. But you know, for reasons that are much discussed elsewhere, just in happenstance, because I had read Capitalist Realism before I published the Vampire Castle essay, but beyond that, I had no idea who he was. Like I think I'd come across K-punk in the aughts, uh, and read some of it, found it interesting, but then I was like, also, losing Atari gobbledygook, I'm going elsewhere, and uh, and I find Fisher's Capitalist Realism, which I've recently reread, and his Ghost of My Life, which is another book that I find more problematic, but actually more interesting because it's more problematic. Um, Very interesting as opposed to late Fisher and the Politics of Joy period and all that, where um but I was struck by your reading of him and where there's real problems even in capitalist realism, where like he almost posits insanity or depression as the
Mm,
beginnings of a liberatory politics. And this focus in Fisher on mental health, and by the end of his writings, you know, when he gets into the work of David Small and whatnot, he's literally full on anti-psychiatric. But also in a way, going back and reading those writings, even though they're not even from a decade ago, it's interesting how much he gets wrong about where the therapeutic is going to go, because he
mm,
thinks they're about to double down on pills and stuff forever. And I'm like, oh, that's all about to end, buddy. Like, it's actually
mm,
about to end very soon. Um, so I was going to ask you, what do you make of capitalist realism now? What do you make of those elements where he tries to find like very individualistic, very psychological ways out? And what do you think about his later populist stuff where he's like really doubling down on like voluntaristic hope in a way that I don't think ends up being all that healthy?
mm. So let me talk a bit about like my experience of reading Fisher and you
Mm,
know where I discovered him and what he means to me. Um, so I started in music journalism around about 2003, and I think I discovered K-punk around the similar time. And I'd always been actually a fan of music journalism. I used to get Select magazine, New NME, Melody Maker, and that was an era where there were really incredible journalists writing for all of those papers, and
mhm,
music criticism was engaged in as a really serious thing. And for me, Fisher like really elevated that by bringing critical theory into it in K-punk, and that was really a gateway into critical theory for me. I have a little bit of a background in it because my dad is a social scientist. He taught at the European University and edited a book alongside Stuart Hall in the 1980s. So I'd read a little bit of Stuart Hall, and I kind of had a
mhm,
political consciousness. What K-punk opened up for me was that there was a mode of writing about pop culture that would use this analysis. And I think, you know, in my first few years as a journalist, that was very much just like an aspiration that I couldn't really fulfill because of the nature of the stuff that I was writing. So it's taken me away a long time to find my way to writing in that kind of, like you said, maybe post Fisher style. And I think in a way, I've always admired his craft and his style more in a way than the politics has concerned me.
mm,
Although obviously, I also take as a starting point a lot of you know the key points from capitalist realism that he's made. Most you know, obviously, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Of course, even that style doesn't belong necessarily to Fisher. It has its roots in Frederick Jameson. You know, Slavoj Žižek is another great example of writing about culture using critical theory to analyze it. And I think, you know, it can also be a little bit of a shallow approach sometimes. Like, you know, it's not like taking a political idea and then talking about any form of media in order to make it accessible is just a brilliant formula. I think it's quite hard to get right the balance of you know, using pop culture to analyze serious ideas. But in
mhm,
terms of, you know, the different stages of Fisher, I think capitalist realism is an odd one. It's such a slim volume that I have reread it a few times, and it strikes me it struck me the last time how much personal detail there is from his life, particularly about, you know, his work as a lecturer and working in a college. So I think like it's easy to think of him in terms of some of the aphorisms that his work has generated, and not to consider that there was, you know, like blogging was a huge stylistic influence on him.
Mm-hmm.
And even when he was writing Capitalist Realism, which has been read and taken as inspiration, you know, as a manifesto, it's still full of details about his personal life. I think as well, you know, the fact that he's not here to evolve those ideas that he might have been wrong about is really interesting. I think there's a lot of people, for instance, that would like to forget the Vampire's Castle essay and say, well, if Fisher was around now, he would have changed his mind about all of that. When someone's gone, their ideas are all that survive. And the contradictions between those ideas are the interesting parts of what's left. You know, the attempt to kind of, I guess, like have a consistent voice is something that living authors are engaged in. So for me, like, that's why I really like reading Mike Watson's work, is I think he's really, really good at picking up parts of Fisher and running with them to a place that Fisher might have run, but also to different places. You know, he's also not afraid to challenge some of the parts of Fisher's work that you've been talking about there. So I think it's maybe the work of other writers to like reconcile those contradictions or even problematize them. For me, the big legacy of Fisher, like I say, is that his style and that way of talking about pop culture using critical theory is probably the biggest influence on my writing. I'd say as well, probably without Fisher, I wouldn't have maybe read farther into critical theory. You know, I don't come from an academic background of philosophy or critical theory. I come from literary criticism. So yeah, he opened up a world for me through music criticism that led to a much broader perspective. So he'll definitely always be a huge influence on me. I think it's maybe up to other writers to carry that on in different ways and explore those contradictions, you know?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things I really like about Fisher. One, of the people working, I mean, we have to also remind ourselves of the critical theory milieu of the aughts when capitalist realism is written. Fisher is part of this blogging movement. You know, early Zero books, for good and ill, was made up of academics and lecturers who were in a precarious situation, often who got their start as bloggers, both in the United States and in Britain, doing all kinds of various things. I mean, object-oriented ontology, which seems very removed from other stuff now. That was that first round of writers. Then, even when Fisher was in charge of Zero, much less when Doug Lane took it over and included scallywags like myself in the editorial process. It was a very different milieu. And one thing I could tell when I was reading your book is like you structure an essay like Fisher structures an essay. like there's an introduction to the concept in pop culture, then there's a launch off into something else. In fact, I would say one of the differences between you, ironically, since you come out of the literary criticism world and music criticism, and as a person who also got my writing starts also in music. I was not a journalist. I was a zine writer. I didn't even get that far,
cool.
but was in music journalism. And then I do have formal training in philosophy and also literary theory. And in America, literary theory and critical theory, I have this strange feeling they've always been more together than they are in Europe. Weirdly, like that's if you were encountering European theory in an American university in the 90s and aughts, you were actually probably encountering it in a literature program, whereas the philosophy programs were, you know, there were some continentals allowed. You know, people would talk about Nietzsche all the time, but most of it was analytic philosophy. So our historical philosophy, like pre 20th century stuff. It was not critical theory. So but Fisher, when I talk about that though, the way critical theorists read about pop culture in the 90s and the early aughts was totally inaccessible. I mean, I actually do agree with that Pierre Bardou, you know, characterization of post-structuralist intellectuals in the 70s and 80s as like basically distinction terrorists, mongering the fact that you can't figure out their symbolic game systems. Fisher, you know, I guess Zizek is another person, but Fisher's whole goal seemed to be to make that stuff accessible, even more than Jameson.
Make it popular.
Right.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that, because there's a, you know, that's one of the principles of journalism is like clarity and accessibility. Those are important things in writing, and I think he humanized a lot of quite complex bits of critical theory in a really interesting way. Yeah, I think that's quite what you said there is very perceptive.
Yeah. So, you know, and so Fisher for me was like a way to engage in that without me having to spend hours and hours decoding Derrida's or figuring out what exactly weird thing from Heidegger that somebody may or may not have been understanding correctly. You know, Fisher you didn't have to do that. It was actually a relief. Now, I want to give the British critical theorist going all the way back to the kind of new left Marxist historians a little bit of credit. And lo and behold, on me to give the British any credit for anything. But in general, the British critical theory tradition writes clearer than in Americans or French. You just do. Like the Americans, we like to pretend that we're French, even though we also hate them for some reason that I don't quite understand. I have a theory about this, but it's not a political one. It's just, you know, the bourgeois revolutionary traditions having jealousy about each other and in denial that they look alike. But nonetheless, I think it's really interesting when I think about Fisher and like the lineage of Stuart Hall, or Frederick Jameson, all of whom are
so one of the reasons I think Stuart Hall wrote in such a clear and accessible way was perhaps to do with the fact he was engaged with the Open University. The Open University was meant to be a university that you could attend like a correspondence college, basically. But it was, you know, affordable, and also the materials were accessible. And what that meant is that, you know, Stuart Hall was a huge figure in the New Left before the OU was founded, was able to contribute to texts that were then, you know, broadly used by universities that were teaching them more complicated stuff, because it gave an accessible in to, you know, subjects like, you know, how the discourse shaped our formations of modernity and questions like that. But even if you go back to his early writings, you know, when he was writing for British newspapers, there's a lucidity and a precision there. And I think in a lot of ways, he's you know, definitely one of the forebears of Fisher in the sense of being able to write about these things in a clear prose style and communicate those ideas in an uncomplicated way.
So I guess this does, you know, the two most important books for me by Fisher are, I mean, there's I guess The Strange and the Eerie too, and I don't think about that one. And there's another one that I always forget about. But Capitalist Realism, Ghost of My Life. And when you talk about the parts of, you know, capitalist realism, when you see parts of Fisher's life go through, because it's part of this blogging thing that he's kind of cleaning up and making into a book. That's also true, I think doubly so in Ghost of My Life. Where there's just so much of his own life in there, even though it's not obvious necessarily. And I'm not a person who is, you know, like a close friend of Mark. We exchanged some letters. I published an infamous essay. I wrote a response to it, and then I wrote some questions for Doug Lane to ask Fisher on an interview once. And that's been, you know, and other than private like messages back and forth, you know, corresponding, me asking questions, me riddling him to try to get a coherent theory of class out of him. That was something I really tried to do. Like, but he really resisted it, like really actively resisted it. Nonetheless, I find that today that Fisher is also symptomatic to me, but in a way that's different because it also intersects with my personal life. Because most of the figures, you know, are people that I don't know. And I'm not like I'm not claiming like this insight to Fisher. We never even met in person. We only exchanged articles and and questions and correspondence. But like, um, um, that makes him an interesting figure for me because
Yeah, for sure.
there's also a way in which I'm haunted by his legacy because I literally worked for his press that he left.
Mm,
And I published the Vampire Castle essay, but also critiqued it. And so he's an interesting figure for me. And I find him to be, just like you mentioned earlier, a person who people have tried to freeze in time, including some of his
yeah.
biggest defenders.
Mhm.
And to pick elements of him that are easier to handle. Like
Yeah.
we try to present a clear, unified Fisher. And I think one of the things I got from your discussions and Mike Watson's discussions, and actually just reading books myself, and I could mention I'm writing something on Ghost of My Life myself, is that he's actually not all that of a consistent figure. There are interesting fracture lines. Even when I
Yes.
mentioned the class, I kept on accusing him of not having a Marxist theory of class, which I still stand by. But I actually went through his work and through K-Punk later on, and I was like, well, no, he does here, but not here, and he does here, but not here, and
Yes, exactly. And I
like,
think like
yeah, go ahead.
like I've had the chance to read a little bit of Mike's next book, which is about addiction and
Mhm.
online capitalism, and he very much kind of does attempt to deal with two of the kind of I guess unfinished aspects of Fisher's work that you've talked about. One the mental health discourse, and one the kind of half-formed ideas of acid communism. So I
Mm.
think you'll find it really interesting where Mike's gone on those 2 points. I think for me, I'm less interested in the acid communism stuff. I'm sure that has some value in it, and I'll return to that part of his work. But I am very interested in how he wrote about mental health, and I actually had to kind of slightly keep that out of this book because I feel like it would have added several other chapters. I think I'm going to probably return to it. How a person, as a person who's had psychiatric treatment for a large part of his life, who takes psychiatric medicine, I'm very interested in the discourse around things like the DSM categories,
Mhm.
the definitions of mental illness. I'm interested in discussions around, the anti-carceral part of mental health discourse at the moment. One of the best writers on this, of course, is Freddie DeBoer. And the fact that, some of Freddie's writing not just is an analysis of his own experiences with bipolar disorder, but also of there are essays out there written by Freddie which are among his best work, which he says he can't read because he wrote them when he was in a manic bipolar phase. So I think De Boer is a perfect example of somebody whose collected works, if they're assembled after long after he's gone, will contain many contradictions, and that's because they were written in different phases of consciousness, driven by his own mental health, his own subjective experience of reality. I am absolutely sure the same is true of Fisher, as someone who experienced depressive disorder. And I think there's almost like a fatalism in reading the work of anybody who took their own life, and he's far from the only philosopher in that category. But in the same way that like I can be massively an admirer of Zizek's ideas, I would distance myself from many of the things that he's written about Islam or about migration. And similarly, I can look at the work of someone like Valerie Solanas and be a massive fan of the way that she satirized, the concepts of masculinity, femininity, without necessarily meaning that I like endorse the fact she shot Andy Warhol. Or Ted Kaczynski is another person whose writing I've taken a lot from. Obviously, I'm not going to endorse him as a bomber, and I think so. The same logic for me applies to Guy Debord, to Mark Fisher. It's too tempting to try and frame what they wrote around what their fate was. I don't
Mhm.
think that that's necessarily helpful, and I also think it is possible to pick and choose from the writing and the thinking of people who massively contradict themselves, whether that's a contradiction between what they wrote and what they did, or within the writing itself. Um, yeah, if that makes sense. I think like that's where I would agree with Fisher is that I think having that wildly diverging psychological perspective on things may be a way to produce forms of writing or forms of ideas that push a little bit beyond what the conventional thinking is. but out in the wilds, it's going to be chaotic. I think for Fisher, he wrote about capitalism as being subject to bipolar cycles that swings up and down, the periods of mania, the periods of depression. I think like the world of capitalism is maybe a little bit more similar to borderline personality disorder, cluster B disorders, where nobody really you can be acting out in the world, having all sorts of grave consequences for your life without really understanding the underlying traumas and triggers that cause those. I think, if anything, there's no pattern in the cycles of boom and bust in capitalism that resembles bipolar. I think is much more resembles the kind of behavioral deficiencies or problematics of a cluster B disorder. So yeah, I'm very interested in what Fisher has to say about mental health, and it's definitely an area of his writing where I would simultaneously be able to argue that broadly the same conclusions and also the opposite, I think.
My readings of Fisher have been, they alternate between, I think some of that stuff is insightful and some of that stuff is a horrible set of don't take all of Fisher's advice about mental health. But I do think that there's something. I mean, you mentioned Bung Chul Han in your book, who's another theorist who's very frustrating to me, and in a way that like I don't have the same relationship to as Fisher, where I sometimes I just get like, there's a lot of times where I agree with Bung Chul Han, but still want to throw his book across the room because I don't think he proved his point. He just like, asserted it, but not even as boldly as John Gray does. So it was, but I do think that there's something there about the intersection of psychology. I was thinking about this the other day. If you were to like write down what the dominant science of our day was off of our discourse around it, you would think right now we were having like this heyday of psychology. But if you actually look at the scientific literature, this actually is a period of particularly what the fuckness when it comes to like almost all the presumptions of replicability. I mean, there's been massive paradigm shifts on it. Like, can we even talk about depression as a coherent singular thing? Et cetera, et cetera.
But that's approaching maybe something that Fisher was driving towards, right? Which is that our psychologies are actually bound up with our societies, that they're not, that disorders don't exist within the person. They're woven into the social fabric. And I think there is, like mainstream discourse is moving more towards that. And
absolutely.
I think that there is maybe a political gap to step into there, where you can therefore say that mental health discourse is inherently political, because mental health conditions are, caused in part by the system of capitalism within which they exist. That they're inextricable. So I think maybe he's had already some influence there on the broader political spectrum rather than just the theory, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, well, I think also we've had to deal with the fact that like, yes, there's problematic assumptions in anti-psychology, and David's smell is not even the worst there. I mean, we can get into Thomas Saz and those people, but there is a real sense in which like even the therapeutic has had to deal with the fact that therapeutic is socially instantiated. But I think that leads you to a series of, I think it leads to more difficulties than answers, actually, when we talk about like this proliferation of self-therapeutic culture, because therapy is so expensive that a lot of people end up doing it and going through it and self-diagnosing and everything on TikTok, and it's become a kind of identity issue in a way that I don't think Fisher could have foresaw. It's funny that you mentioned borderline personality disorder. I'm also a scholar of Christopher Lasch, another person from a different time period who also was a critical theorist who wrote maybe too clearly in a way that became a problem later on. And I don't want to just parrot all of Lasch's paradigms, because I'm not a Freudian in that sense, and I also think some of it is slightly pseudoscientific. But I do think he did have an insight in his culture of narcissism that's quite interesting. In that when you mentioned borderline, he actually talked about Fordism as secondary narcissism, and what was developing, what we'd later call neoliberalism, as primary narcissism. And then if you extrapolate from that schema, what would come after those two things, if you continued down that path, would be borderline personality cluster B disorders.
Mm.
So, like, are what he would call in a classical Freudian sense, like total psychic devastation.
Mm.
So, in that sense, I do think there's an interesting schema there where this focus on the self moves from like identifying yourself with the institution, one form of narcissism, to identifying the only limit to the self being yourself, primary narcissism, to not feeling like you have a self at all because you're constantly constructing it. You're actually having to construct authenticity all the time, which leads to authenticity being completely unavailable to you. This is a good Bung Chul Han point. Well, if you take that framework from Lasch and Freud, it actually indicates you are in borderline world where like you're just wanting people to recognize you, and it's leading to incoherent and disordered relations where you don't understand your triggers, you don't understand your limitations, and you're just basically responding in more and more hyperbolic ways.
Mm. I did an episode of the podcast about like wellness cults and the idea of the celebrity is the ultimate parasite, essentially, a psychic parasite that we have, because they represent that unattainable, perfected, photoshopped wellness. But they also advocate that you can always improve yourself, work on yourself. So I think these ideas are very live. But at the same time, I think Jonathan Haidt writes about anti-fragility. The human body is anti-fragile. If you don't exercise, then the muscles get weaker. It has to experience adversity in order to become strong. And he makes that same argument about mental health. And while I think like a lot of Haidt's arguments are basically small c conservative arguments, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, maybe try doing a bit of this, a bit of that. And they do broadly echo things like cognitive behavioral therapy. I've had benefit from those forms of behavioral therapy, which are about looking at your assumptions, looking at the way that you frame your readings of narratives within the world and within other people's behaviors. So I in a way, like, my view on that is less towards the anti-psychiatric and more towards the pro-psychiatric, in that I think those interventions are helpful if they're about not even building like a more coherent self, but about building a more functional self. And it certainly surprised me to find that what has helped me out of depressive states or aberrant behavior has been more structure, has been more organization within my life and more structure. That's kind of the opposite of what I maybe would have expected. I might have thought, like, if I could be freer, then I will be happier, or I would feel less confined or oppressed. In actual fact, the more rigid the structure is, I think the more comfortable I am. And where that brings me back to Bung Chul Han is that it can be quite comfortable to be the citizen, to be the citizen at the heart of a panopticon. That's quite a beguiling image, especially for people with narcissistic tendencies to never know if they're being watched, but always believe that they are. And I kind of think that's where we find ourselves. So then it's just for me about how do you react to that as an individual? If it's the case that, we are going to be surveilled, we are going to be monitored, we could be subject to a collapse, which would mean dwindling or patchy infrastructure. We can entertain all of these as things that might happen, but they are already happening to people all over the world. They have already happened in history to people, millions, thousands of people in history have lived under oppressive regimes, have lived through periods where there was harsh censorship or controls or limits on behavior.
It's actually sort of the historical norm, actually.
People are living there now. It's the historical norm. And so therefore we can, we can temper idealism about how society should be with a recognition that it's possible to live under conditions that most of us would maybe consider intolerable, and also would be quite happy to ignore as long as they aren't happening to us.
Yeah, I do think that it gives us the point of hope. Although I was going to ask you, have you read a lot in the communization theory? Because your book weirdly, in a way that doesn't read like communization theory at all. but
No, I
seems to
don't think
touch.
I have read a lot of that stuff. I mean, name a few authors I might have picked up a bit.
Aaron Benyevev, the Endnotes Collective.
No, I haven't come across these guys, but it's Endnotes Collective.
Yeah, Tikkun in France, those guys. Because I'm not a communization theorist, I have a lot of critiques in, but I do think some of the stuff that they talk about is becoming comfortable with failure and collapse as actually the precondition for actually having movement.
Yes,
It is the idea that like get rid of your old hopes and dreams and find new hopes and dreams in the process of letting that go. And while I don't come to the conclusions they do, like I'm not going to get into specific ones about environmental collapse or the riot as the primary form of political activism and blah blah blah, because I also agree with you. Actually, focus on riots is like focus on occupations is actually getting kind of torn up in the immediate carnival response, or in this case carnival as forest fire or natural reaction even. But I do think that there's a sense in which like uh I push back on people are going to read your book and they're going to think you're black pilled. I brought that up in the beginning. People are constantly accusing me personally of being like too negative, black pilled, whatever. And I'm like, but if you think I'm doing it just so that the end result is you feel like there's nothing, that's not the point. The point is like some of these hopes you're using to obscure reality in a way that makes them an impossible hope. Whereas
yes.
if you were to remove the coping mechanism, you could actually build a real, more substantive, more durable, possibly actionable hope.
That's
And
precisely it, Derek. And I think the way I phrased that in the book is that to say that we're living in a world with no future is to demand that the future is reimagined.
yeah, um, I'm super excited about your book. I'm glad that we're on the same press, even though I have a strange feeling that Revol Press is gonna get an attitude of being the bummer of the left presses.
I
Like,
hope not. Yeah, I've had a wee glimpse at some of the other covers, and I think we are all kind of like coming for some of the utopian shibboleths on the
yeah,
left. But I think there's always a bit of hope in those narratives about the negative side of things. Like we've been saying, unless you pass through the eye of the needle, how are you going to see what's on the other side in a way?
yeah, yeah, and I think that's that's a good place to end and a good place to end your book, which you did. Because otherwise I would say it gets pretty heavy. I would I'm just gonna plug when I read your book, I was like, oh, you have this thought worm that I also have, and you've been reading this reactionary thinker that I also read that I didn't think anyone else read. So I very much felt a kinship by reading your book. I was like, someone else who like thinks Peter Turchin's a weirdo. Um, uh, someone else who like thought that yeah, Nick Bostrom's a reactionary, but there's actually interesting stuff in that book.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
are those series of I mean, that book that I have by him is actually a series of essays over probably about 15 years. But um someone else who paid attention to Sam Beckman Fried being a weird effective altruist. I think everyone's picking that up now, but um
yeah.
so I do think people who like Varn World are gonna like this book, and I also think people should check out your podcast. I actually listened to one of the episodes with with Joshua Ellis to prepare for
Mm,
this, and I was like really much like, oh yeah, this guy like knows like some of the stuff about America in a really intimate way. That's really good to kind of work through. That you don't. I find it weird actually that leftists don't talk more about leftists in America. I understand why British leftists wouldn't, but like don't talk more about the weird repercussions of American regulations and laws and their downstream
mm,
effects, because they actually are really important when we're talking about like what are we going to do about the environment. Well, there's been weird
yeah.
knock-on stuff.
If you want to be an effective activist, then
Mm,
thinking about infrastructure and how that could be improved to support climate goals is absolutely a place to start.
yeah.
No, it's
Um,
thank you for taking time to consider all the ideas in the book and to engage with me. I really, really appreciate it. I'm very much excited to read yours now for similar reasons. So yeah, no, hopefully we can do a little podcast exchange. We'll have you back on Strange Exiles when your book comes, and we'll have another big chat then.
Yeah, I have
fun.
about 4 chapters half written. So like, for those of you who don't know, I've been writing a book on Christopher Lasch that I set aside to write this book. Not that I'm never going to do the Lasch book, but my co-author in the Lasch book is finishing a dissertation, and she optimistically thought it would take about 1.5 years to finish, and we're like 3 years into this now, and I'm like, okay. So I'm doing this book in the interim on my big scholarly Christopher Lasch monstrosity. But it is on similar themes. It's more focused on specifically the way there has been a weird dynamic of flipping back and forth between ideas, between vertical horizontalism and apocalypticism and hyper optimism. And
that sounds brilliant, man. It sounds really fascinating.
Mark Fisher and David Graeber, almost literally manifesting 2 spectrums of this, even within going back and forth in opposite positions in different points of their own lives, and trying not to make them univocal, because I actually think that's a fundamental mistake. With both, Graeber tried to be more univocal than Fisher did, I think, but neither one of them are actually terribly consistent. And I would also venture to say, if you read Bram's or my work over the course of 20 years, you would be like, oh, those guys are right. I mean, for me, like, when I started writing, I was a fucking reactionary. So like, you would very much be inconsistent. I think trying to impose univocality on a person is a fundamental mistake.
It's again maybe a consequence of us all thinking of ourselves as brands, because if you think of yourself as a brand, then it's a good thing to be reduced to a single aphorism. But I think Mark, as a writer, would probably have resisted that.
Definitely. And well, on that note, thank you so much. People should check out your
thank you so much, Derek.
Your book.
Yeah, you can get the book at Linktree / The Darkest Timeline. That's nice. Get the copy over there.
All right.
Thank you so much for having me, man.
Yeah, thank you.